Hello, welcome to my little cabin in the woods. Today we're going to talk about something a little bit different than my usual subject matter, which is camping and hunting and fishing and hiking and period clothes of the early 20th century. Today I want to talk a little bit about doing good quality research as a way of building your impression in the early 20th century. Now this information, some of it is going to apply to any living history impression, but I'm going to be specifically talking about the early 20th century. So I've put on my historian clothes, and we're going to get into some interesting stuff today. Alright, glad you're coming along for this adventure. So I need to say something right here, and I apologize, it's going to feel really dry and really academic. But when we're talking about research, there's something really important we need to go over first, and that is documentation. So documentation is your resources that support what you are trying to do. So if you write a paper in college, the professor will ask you to put your sources at the end of that paper. That's your documentation. That says, I know what I'm talking about because I used these sources. Unfortunately, there's good sources and there's bad sources. So what you need to do is you need to break that down and look at where your sources are coming from. So you've got primary source documentation, and that is anything that was produced in the period. So if you're looking at, say, World War I, you want to look at soldiers' diaries, newspaper articles, even film footage and photographs that existed from that point in history. And that's all primary source documentation. So then the next step down from that is secondary source documentation. That is where someone else, usually a historian, has taken a whole bunch of primary source documentation, glued it together, and said, this is my interpretation of what happened at this point in history based on these resources. And that's usually fairly good. Unfortunately, some people are not as good at interpreting primary documentation as others, and their own bias goes in there, so sometimes you get something that's a little skewed. And then there's some people that will just go way off the charts and say that, you know, the Holocaust never happened because blah, 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 and their sources look good, but they're interpreting them wrong. So you got to be aware of that. But generally, secondary sources are pretty good. And then you've got tertiary sources. Tertiary means it's third level. So you've had primary source documentation that's been distilled down by historians, and then someone has taken the works of multiple historians and said, this is my assumption based on what these historians have said. So it's being regurgitated a third time, basically. And so that's not usually very good. This is why movies are so terrible to use for documentation. And I will put in right here that you have to differentiate a silent film that was made in the 19-teens or 20s is primary source documentation. It is not something that you would want to use to, say, write a paper about the Revolutionary War using a Revolutionary War period film from the 20s. That would not be good. Just like using one today would not be good. So the movie itself is only documentation for the period that the movie was made in, not what it's about. So anyway, sidetrack there, sorry. So your tertiary sources, you want to try to avoid those as much as possible. Don't use movies, don't use what someone else has said, don't use other reenactors. Because other reenactors usually, unless they've spent a lot of time looking at primary sources, those reenactors are generally going to be regurgitating what other historians have said. That's a little different in the early 20th century because there aren't a lot of people writing about it yet, but it's coming. And we are reaching that point where we can look back through a window of 100 years and kind of put things into perspective, which makes it really interesting to look at this, and you can kind of see the cause and effect of everything that happened during that period. So that's a lot of fun. Anyway, off the dry academia there, just wanted to give you guys kind of an idea of how to glean what's usable and what's not. So I've got a few primary sources here, and these things are easy to come by for this period. It's a lot harder if you're doing earlier periods, but we're focusing on the early 20th century, and so this stuff is available. It's on eBay. It's all kinds of like Google Books. There's lots of stuff that's been digitized online. There's archives online. There's JSTOR. There's so many things that you can access right now, and it's possible, you know, with it being so recent, 100 years, it's possible to actually own your own library of primary documents if you really wanted to. I do. Most people aren't that into it, but I want to show you some of the really cool things that I have. So this is a diary, and it was never entirely finished, but it's got a lot in it. And it begins, it says inside, it says, "For my mother, with love, Christmas 1921, William." And so presumably this is William's mother's diary. It was published by Ward's, the department store. Actually the copyright date is 1892, which is kind of neat too. So it starts with January 1, and it's got 5 slots, and it says 19, you put in the rest. So she actually did fill quite a bit of this, but for January 1, we've got 1922, 1923, 1924, 1925, and 1926. This is a way to get a glimpse into an entire year, several years, of the life of this woman. Very valuable information. Now this is something that I found on eBay. This is a collection of photographs from a motoring trip out west. And this is just too neat. So there's lots of photographs of this family's adventure, and they wrote notes in it. Here we have Rome, Oregon, July 4th, 1927. Ranchers were just cutting and raking first crop. So a lot of the photographs in this one is landscape and things that are going on, and that's interesting, but really what we like to find are these photographs that show the people, the clothes that they're wearing, the automobiles that they're driving. That's the kind of stuff that's really fun. But having this whole collection of their stories, their adventures, with their notations written in, really is phenomenal. And like I said, this was, I forget how much I paid for it. It wasn't much. But these things are out there. There's also a lot of original and reproduction documents that are published that you can find online. This is the Coleman Motor Camper's Manual. I think this is an original one here, not a facsimile. But something like this, boy, this is going to show you all the camping equipment that was used. It's going to show you photographs with clothing in it, so you can really get a good idea of what people are wearing when they're camping. Of course, this is produced, and some of these scenes are obviously staged, but it was done in the period, so the clothing is right. Maybe some of it may be a little impractical or overpriced that the ordinary person wouldn't have had, but if you're doing an upper class camping impression, you can pretty much take this stuff to the bank. So these are great. If you can find these, I found this one on eBay as well. Some books are a lot harder to come by. This one's extremely rare. This is Motor Camping on Western Trails by Melville Ferguson. And it is a very thick book with all the details of a motor camping trip that these folks took. I believe it was in 1923. And they went from their home, I can't remember where they started now, it was East Coast. And they went all the way to California. And then they put the cars on a steamer and went to Hawaii and played around in Hawaii for a while. And this is just his memoirs of that trip. And it was written within a couple of years after he did the trip, so it was still pretty fresh in his mind and based on his diaries. There's so much great information in this and wonderful stories. And there's lots of books like this. At this time, everybody that was going on an adventure in a car was writing a book about it. Sometimes they were travelogues, sometimes they were stories like this, and it's great stuff. Now, don't rule out, also, I've got a few novels in here in my bookcase, and these were written between 1909 and 1930, and some of them were written as young adult novels. There's Tom Swift and all kinds of great stuff that was written in that period, and they're fun adventures, and they're pure fiction, but they were written in that period to be the latest modern stories for young people. And that information is surprisingly valuable because you're getting, more than anything, you're getting the colloquialisms of the language and slang that was common in that period. And I've learned so much just from reading silly dime store novels that you wouldn't believe. So that's just some examples. There's lots of other stuff out there. And one thing that we have now that historians in the past have not had is we have a lot of great access via the internet. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how to do that. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is Google. Google is a great resource. It can also get you into a lot of trouble, so pay attention to what you're looking at. Make sure that what you're seeing is truly primary source or a good secondary source, and not just somebody's silly web page. So one of the things I really like to do with Google is Google Books. There's a whole lot of books that are out of print, or the copyright has expired on them, and Google has scanned them and uploaded them into Google Books. And there's lots of things that you can find. It's amazing. There's books on motor camping, there's stories that people have written, and all dating back to the period that we're trying to recreate. So Google Books is an excellent resource. It's fully searchable. It's definitely a great way to find a lot of primary documentation without spending any money at all. Also, JSTOR is a wonderful resource. This was originally designed for college level research, and at one point it was all restricted to only academia, so you had to be a student or a professor to access it. Now they do offer some options as far as a paid subscription that anybody can get, and there's lots of wonderful information on there, including primary sources as well as secondary sources, really good academic secondary sources. So I'd highly recommend JSTOR as well. Now moving on, one thing that I like to do a lot is get on eBay. Of course, I find books to buy on eBay, but the other thing that I'll do is I'll type in 1920s camping photograph or something like that and see what pops up. And a lot of times you'll see photographs and images that have never been published anywhere else before. And you can buy them, or you can choose not to buy them and just look at the cool pictures, which is something I like to do. Always a wonderful adventure scrolling through eBay on these things. Now, social media, again, can be touchy because sometimes you get into stuff that's not very good research or very well done. But I have found more often than not on various Facebook groups relating to the hobby that there's a lot of good stuff being put out there by ordinary folks who happen to run across it somewhere and say, hey, this is really cool, my friends are going to like this, and so they'll put it on there. Some of the groups that I recommend on Facebook are the Amalgamated Order of Motor Campers. That's a group that is specifically focused around the idea of going camping with an automobile in the period from about 1900 to 1930. So that's a wonderful resource. Lots of cool stuff goes up there, and people doing things. Also in that same vein is Bannerman's Camp, Classic and Vintage Motor Camping Living History. We all have a tendency for very long names on these groups. So anyway, this one I've really enjoyed because they put a lot of good stuff on there. The admins do a lot of great stuff, and the individuals on the group do a lot of really good stuff as well. And so there's always something interesting to read, either a link to an article or a video someone's produced or something really good, some photographs or original gear being pulled out. So lots of great resources on there, lots to learn. Also, Early 20th Century Sportsmen, 1890 to 1930. This is a wonderful group focused entirely around hunting, fishing, camping, hiking, bushcraft in that period. So lots of good stuff goes on here as well. These are all wonderful history-centered groups that are in it not just to have fun, but to actually learn things as well. And there's other groups like that. There's a whole bunch of them on there, and if you get involved with one, you'll pretty easily find the other ones. But these are the top three that really seem to have the most going on, and I really like them. So YouTube is also a great resource. Obviously you know about YouTube because you're watching this video, but there are some people on YouTube you should know about. One of them is Sarge Vining. He also runs the Bannerman's Camp page, and he puts a lot of wonderful videos out, sometimes exploring an original piece of gear, or talking about a camp that he's done, or getting into some history. Lots of good stuff. He really knows his stuff. One that I recently found that I really like is a fella. He's over on the wild side, and he's been doing a lot of 1860s camping, civilian based, out west, and has some really nice videos and really does a lot of cool experimental archaeology sort of things. And he runs around with a couple of goats, so that's always fun. Another great one is the Honorable Outfitters, Mr. Dyer's Musings. This fella does a lot of getting out and doing it. He'll take an idea and run with it and go try it, and really has a lot of fun with it. You can tell he's having fun, and sometimes his results are quite interesting. So definitely worth checking out. And then a little bit early, again on our period mostly, but kind of rolls into it. If you're interested in the history of spirits in the late Victorian period, I highly recommend the Victorian Barroom. These videos are so well done. They're very polished. Brian Cushing really knows his stuff, and they do amazing videos, he and his wife. So definitely recommend that as an interesting aside that kind of fits into the period as well. So that's some of the stuff that you can find online, and I highly recommend that you check those out as well. Well, I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you've learned something about how to produce a better impression in living history. The real takeaway here is you don't have to do a subpar impression. You don't have to guess. You don't have to do the best you can when all of this information is at your fingertips. There's so much out there between the internet and books and resources that are readily available online and in person. Your local library probably has a huge collection of photographs and books and personal diaries that have been donated over the years, and all you got to do is look for it. And in this period we have not only written documentation, but we've got photographic evidence and even video evidence, and those resources are readily available, and you can perfect your impression to the point that it is spot on. So I hope that you've enjoyed this. We'll see you again next time.